Nice continues to work on photography from its invention in 1826 until his death in 1833, and during the late 1820s and the early 1830s, he worked with a partner, Louis Daguerre. And Daguerre continues his experiments after Nice's death, ultimately refining the process into what we call the daguerreotype, obviously named after Daguerre. This example from 1837 is one of the earliest, the oldest extant daguerreotype, and at this point the process was still pretty rudimentary. One of the drawbacks of a daguerreotype is that the image shows up on a metal plate. It's not reproducible. You can't create multiple images like we can with modern photography. Daguerre's big breakthrough is that he invented a version of what we would call development in photography today, that the image that is in the final piece does not necessarily need to be visible to the naked eye when it's first exposed to light. So the daguerreotype process uses a sheet of silver-coated copper that's polished to a mirror shininess, a mirror sheen. And that plate is then placed in the camera and exposed to light. This creates a latent image, which is not visible to the naked eye, but which can be treated with fumes of mercury, which causes that image to become visible. Over time, Daguerre refines and speeds up this process, and it becomes much more practical in the commercial sense. So what we see here is a portrait of Daguerre himself, made just a few years later in 1844, and we can already see that that image is much clearer than the previous daguerreotype, with much finer details. Daguerreotypes are still expensive, and at this time photography is largely still restricted to wealthy inventors and tinkerers. But the daguerreotype makes this a very practical process, and for the first time we can really take pictures of people and animals, not just still objects. And Daguerre could have patented this process and made himself extremely wealthy. But instead he goes to the French government and offers to put this process in the public domain, in exchange for receiving a pension, a certain amount of money, every year. Initially, Nice's heirs, his sons, object on the grounds that their father is not getting enough credit, but when the amount of money that they're receiving goes up, they drop their objection, and this is allowed to go forward. And this is incredibly important to the development of photography, because what that means is that photography develops very quickly through the 19th century, and it's not restricted by patents or copyrights. It's not kept as a trade secret, but really anyone who wants to learn about photography is able to learn about photography, and many people over the course of the 19th century contribute to the development of photography. Some of the drawbacks of the daguerreotype, like I already mentioned, is that it's a single image, and because it's only on a metal plate, it's prone to tarnishing. We can see even in this image, the edges of this image are slightly tarnished, and so they have to be kept behind glass and treated very carefully. However, within just a few years of this image being made, processes that are much more familiar to us start to be experimented with. So you might have seen tintype photographs before that are printed onto a metal sheet, or you might have heard of a glass plate negative that uses glass as a clear negative to create the final photograph. Over the course of the 19th century, early photographers also experimented with using paper negatives, which were cheap and lightweight, easy to transport, not as heavy or breakable as glass, but had the drawback of not being clear or transparent in the way that glass was. Ultimately, all of this leads up to the end of the 19th century, and in the 1890s we have the invention of the first celluloid film, the ancestor of the type of film camera that you may have used before in your own life.